When you think about a medical diagnosis, there's usually this expectation of absolute precision. Like, you fall, your arm hurts, the X-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor just points to the screen and says, well, there's your problem.
Right. It's clean. It's, completely binary. It's either broken or not broken.
Exactly. But the moment you step out of a clinic and into the realm of civilizational collapse, like when you start looking at the architecture of entire societies, that X-ray machine just completely shatters.
Yeah, the diagnostic landscape becomes incredibly murky.
It really does. And, if you are listening to this right now, think about the complex systems you navigate every day. Your workplace, your local government, the global supply chain. When those things fail, we all kind of want to point to one simple, obvious fracture.
Oh, sure. A bad leader. Or like a single bad policy. We crave that kind of clarity.
We do. But the reality of why a massive human system fails is just, it's never that clean. And that actually brings us to the mission for you today on this deep dive. Because we are taking a foundational ancient text, specifically Surah Al-Mu'minun, verses 34 through 43, and we are going to completely upend the way it is traditionally read.
Yeah, we really are, because the standard historical reading of passages like this, for centuries, it's been viewed through this strictly theological, almost mystical lens.
Like it's just a story about ancient miracles.
Exactly. The narrative goes something like, ancient nations were magically punished, struck down by divine lightning bolts because they refused to say the correct religious words, or they failed to perform the proper rituals.
Right, it's framed as like a divine temper tantrum.
Totally. And today, we are tossing that entire frame out the window. We're looking at this text not as a mystical document, but as a really sophisticated masterclass text in sociology and civilizational systems engineering.
Okay, let's unpack the actual mechanics of what you're suggesting here, because it is it's a massive shift in perspective. If you actually read the text, there is this repeating, almost rhythmic pattern.
Yeah, it catalogs multiple nations, starting from Noah and moving forward in time.
Right. And each nation is sent a messenger. Each nation aggressively, often violently, denies that messenger, and then each nation is subsequently destroyed.
And the traditional surface-level hook is always, God got angry.
Right, but you're arguing from our sources that this is a fundamental misreading of the systemic reality at play.
It completely misses the structural argument the text is making. To understand it, we actually have to look at the concept of
Kufr, which is usually just translated as disbelief, right?
Which instantly traps it in a religious framework. But in the sociological register of this text, kufr is not a religious failing. It's a systemic category. It is the active, violent refusal of a feedback loop.
Okay, a feedback loop. Like we use that term in software engineering, right? Or biology, or climate science, something that tells the system it's going off course.
Exactly. These ancient societies didn't fail because they lacked personal piety. They collapsed because their social architectures became inherently flawed. They were deeply exploitative and mathematically unsustainable.
So the messenger in this framework wasn't some wizard arriving to perform magic tricks.
No, the messenger was the ultimate feedback mechanism. They arrived to diagnose the fatal contradictions within the society's operating system.
Wow. So the collapse happens because the society rejects the only diagnostic tool capable of correcting their structural errors.
Right, before the entire edifice crumbles under its own immense weight.
So to use an analogy, it's like you're driving down the highway and the check engine light starts flashing red. The engine is literally telling you there is a fatal pressure buildup.
Yeah, but instead of pulling over and fixing the underlying mechanical flaw,
you decide the light itself is annoying. So you take a hammer, smash the dashboard, and just keep driving.
That is a perfect analogy.
And then when the engine explodes 10 miles down the road, you stand by the burning car and call it an act of God.
That captures the dynamic perfectly.
Oh, yeah.
The text we are dissecting meticulously documents this exact cycle of denial and destruction. It serves as a diagnostic manual for civilizational failure.
But to understand how these highly complex systems fail, the text argues we first have to understand how they were built, right?
Yeah, it points out that humanity began as a single, undivided community. The Arabic term used is umma wahida.
Umma wahida.
Right. No class divisions, no socioeconomic stratifications, just a unified human fabric.
Now, a unified human fabric sounds ideal, but obviously if you look at a history book, that didn't last. Divisions arose. And looking at the source notes we have for this deep dive, they point to a very specific, almost shocking culprit for this division.
Yes, human intellect.
Now, I have to push back hard on this. Wait a minute. Reason and intellect are supposed to be the tools that solve our problems, right? We celebrate intellect. Why is human reason suddenly the villain in this sociological
I
framework?
know it sounds crazy. It is a brilliant, highly counterintuitive paradox. The text describes this fracturing as a battle of wits. To understand why intellect is the driver of division, we have to look at its evolutionary function.
Okay, lay it out for me.
Well, human intellect is inherently tied to biological self-preservation. It is designed to secure advantages first for the self, then the family, then the tribe. It's a tool of optimization.
Right.
When a specific group uses its highly developed intellect to protect and expand its own vested interests, it inevitably collides with other groups who are using their intellects to do the exact same thing.
Ah, okay. So the intellect isn't inherently evil in some cartoonish way, but it is fundamentally biased toward its host. It lacks objectivity.
Exactly. Intellect alone cannot bridge the gap between competing human factions because the intellect is the very tool being used to actively design the walls.
Wow.
If my brilliant intellect is dedicated entirely to ensuring my tribe controls the only river in the valley, and your brilliant intellect is dedicated to ensuring your tribe controls that same river, our combined intellects do not magically synthesize into peace.
No, they create an arms race.
We just develop more sophisticated weapons, more complex legal justifications, and more cunning strategies to fight over the water. It becomes an infinite loop of rationalized self-interest.
Which means you can't fix the bug from inside the program. If the internal operating system, human reason, is caught in this infinite loop of tribal advantage, you need an external code to break the cycle.
And this brings us to the true systemic function of the messenger in this ancient text. They're not arriving to preach feel-good sermons about neighborly love while the societal structure remains violently unequal.
Right, they arrive bearing an objective external code.
A legal and economic framework designed specifically to erase the class differences and dismantle the exploitative hierarchies that the human intellect so carefully constructed.
And the text emphasizes that this external code is necessary because it comes from a universal source. The term used is Rab-ul-Alamin, which roughly translates to the sustainer of all systems, all peoples, all ecosystems.
It's crucial because it means this code doesn't belong to any single tribe, race, or economic class.
Right, it doesn't have a horse in the race. It's the ultimate objective referee.
Think about modern international law or, global climate summits. We constantly hit a wall because every single nation tries to bend the rules to favor its own economic output or its own geopolitical security.
So true.
The sociological argument this text is making is that a fundamentally exploitative system can never be cured by the architects who benefit from the exploitation. The cure, the rebalancing, must originate from an objective outside coordinate.
I want to ground this for the listener because the abstract theory is fascinating, but the text actually provides a typology of civilizational fractures. It walked through different societies as case studies of how this battle of wits tore them apart. Let's trace this evolutionary timeline of human exploitation, starting with the first major fracture.
Right, the society of Noah.
Exactly.
The story of Noah is critical because it represents the baseline fracture, the biological elite. In that era, the division was strictly racial and tribal. The elites believed their high status was an inherited, unchangeable biological reality.
Like an aristocracy of blood.
They viewed themselves exactly like that. If you were not born into the right genetic lottery, you were structurally irrelevant.
And this is where the traditional Sunday school narrative gets completely subverted. Most people listening have probably heard the story of Noah's son drowning in the flood. It's usually framed as a tragic family drama, the rebellious kid who wouldn't listen to his dad and get on the boat. But reading this through our systems engineering lens, the drowning of the son isn't a family tragedy, it's a structural manifesto.
That's spot on. Noah is introducing a radical systemic shift. He's proposing an architecture built on ideological alignment over blood ties. When the systemic collapse of the flood is imminent, Noah asks to save his son.
He's operating under the old rules.
Yes, assuming biological lineage still dictates survival. But the systemic feedback he receives is brutal, objective, and clear. He is not of your family.
That response is staggering. He is not of your family, even though biologically they share the exact same DNA.
Because the new architecture the system is building does not recognize biological lineage as a valid metric for belonging or survival. Shared ideological commitment to the objective law is the only metric that matters.
So the system is stating unequivocally that biological elitism is a fatal error code.
It is completely irrelevant to the survival of a civilization. If your son does not share the ideological commitment to a balanced, non-exploitative society, he is part of the disease. He's the vulnerability in the code.
Imagine being told that your own child is fundamentally excluded from your survival pod because his ideological framework threatens the entire future system. It is incredibly stark. It completely erases nepotism at the absolute most fundamental level.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
Okay, so that's the initial fracture, biological tribalism. But human societies evolve, become more complex, and so do the methods of exploitation. As we move down the timeline to the nation of Oud, the fracture shifts.
Yeah, in the nation of Oud, the fracture moves from biology to politics. The text describes a society where the administrative division of labor morphed into outright tyranny.
Okay, how so?
Well, originally, administrators were just civil servants people, given a specific job by the public to manage affairs, organize infrastructure, coordinate resources. But over time, the administrators began to hoard the power inherent in their roles. The civil servants became the masters. The society split violently into two distinct classes, the rulers and the ruled.
How does that actually happen mechanically? I mean, it's the classic political decay. You give someone the keys to the city so they can lock the gates at night for everyone's safety. It makes sense, right? It's a good system.
Right.
But within 3 generations, their grandkids are charging you an exorbitant tax just to look at the gates and deploying armed guards to enforce it. The utility becomes a weapon.
The creeping centralization of power is a really well-documented sociological phenomenon, and the text maps it perfectly. And that political power inevitably leads to the next evolutionary phase of civilizational fracture.
Which the text illustrates with the nation of Thamud.
Exactly. In Thamud, the division shed its political disguise and became purely nakedly economic. Society split into landowners, the zamindars, and the peasants, the huzaras. The elite hoarded the actual physical means of survival.
The water sources and the grazing lands. I love this part of the deep dive because this isn't ancient history at all. If you swap out water sources for microchips or lithium mines or pharmaceutical patents, it is exactly like modern corporate monopolies choking off global supply chains.
Oh, 100%.
If you control the absolute bottleneck of a resource, you control the people. It is resource capture in its purest, most ruthless form.
And this is where the linguistic precision of the source text reveals its depth. The text uses a specific word, Israf, to describe the actions of the elites in Thamud. Now, if you look at standard translations, Israf is usually translated as extravagance or wasting money.
Right. The image that comes to mind is buying a solid gold toilet or a fleet of luxury sports cars. Just gross overspending.
But if you dig into the agrarian sociological root of the word Israf in the Arabic of the peninsula, it means something far more sinister. It actually means to intercept water in a communal canal before it reaches the fields that desperately need it downriver.
Wow. Okay, so it has nothing to do with what you are spending on yourself. It is entirely about what you are aggressively withholding from others.
Yes, exactly.
It is the active engineering of artificial scarcity. You are cutting off the irrigation to your neighbor's crops, so yours can be artificially abundant, while theirs literally wither and die.
The text pairs this with another critical word, Fasad. Again, you'll usually see this translated vaguely as corruption or mischief.
Right, which sounds so generic.
But in this strict sociological context, Fasad is the specific act of creating socioeconomic imbalance. It is the deliberate structuring of inequality.
So it's systemic.
Completely. The elites in the capital cities referred to collectively in the text as the mala, were the engine of this Fasad, because their entire accumulation of wealth and power depended entirely on maintaining this artificial imbalance. If the water flowed equally, their leverage would evaporate.
And the opposite of Fasad in the text is Ayla, which means reform or restoring the balance. So when the messenger arrives bringing Ayla, they aren't bringing a new way to chant or pray.
No, not at all.
They are bringing a direct mandate to smash the dams that are intercepting the water. They are a direct existential threat to the economic foundation of the mullah.
Which leads us to one of the most profound psychological insights in the entire text. I mean, how do the elites, the Mela, respond to this threat? Because they are sophisticated.
Right. They can't just be cartoon villains.
Exactly. They don't just stand up at the public square and say, we enjoy hoarding the water while you starve, go away.
Yeah.
They have to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. They need a PR strategy to neutralize the messenger.
And the text points out a repeating phrase. It's almost verbatim across all these different historical nations. Whenever the elites want to dismiss the messengers, they deploy the specific line, Mahata ila bashrun mithlukum. The translation is, This is nothing but a human being like you.
Right, and traditional theological readings treat this as a debate about the supernatural. They assume the elites are genuinely upset because they expected a glowing angel to descend from the clouds, and they're just disappointed to see a regular guy who eats food and walks in the marketplace.
Like it's a customer service complaint about the messenger.
Yeah. But if we read it sociologically, this is a calculated class argument.
Hold on, I want to dig into this. Why are the vested interests so utterly obsessed with pointing out that the messenger is just a human? What is the threat of his humanity?
It completely destroys the protection racket. Look at how ancient and, frankly, many modern power structures operate. If the authority to rule, to make laws, and to distribute resources requires a supernatural origin, then the elites can claim to be the sole interpreters of that divine will.
The kings, the high priests, the upper castes.
Yes. They build a narrative. The gods speak only to us through our exclusive rituals. It creates an unbridgeable moat around their authority.
Ah, I see. If God is up in the clouds, the elites construct the only ladder, and they charge a massive, crippling toll to anyone who wants to know what God is actually saying.
Now imagine a messenger arrives. He doesn't claim to be a demigod. He doesn't perform magic tricks in the sky. He says, I am just a human being exactly like you, but I have the objective, rational code to balance our society and distribute the water fairly.
Oh, wow.
If the law requires absolutely no supernatural certificate to be valid, if its validity is based entirely on its rational ability to create equity, then the elite's monopoly on authority is instantly vaporized.
Because it means the law applies equally to everyone. If the messenger is just a human like you, then the king is just a human like the peasant. There is no divine right of kings.
Exactly.
And if they are both just biological humans, then on what rational grounds does the king get to hoard all the water while the peasant dies of thirst?
The Mullahs deny the message not because it is intellectually wrong, but because it is socially correct, and that correctness threatens the arrangement that benefits them. By shouting to the public, he's just a human, he has no supernatural backing, they are trying to delegitimize the socioeconomic reforms.
That is so manipulative.
They are demanding a supernatural prerequisite for justice that they know doesn't exist, simply so they don't have to enact the justice.
Which feeds directly into the epistemological trap they set. There is another recurring phrase from the elites in the text. Wakwalulan numina hatidona mitlama utierusullah. They demand miracles. They demand signs and proofs. We won't believe your reforms until you show us a supernatural miracle.
This is the ultimate evasion tactic. I mean, why demand a miracle when the problem is socioeconomic?
Right.
If your society is starving because a tiny fraction of the population is hoarding the grain and someone brings a mathematical logistical blueprint to distribute the grain fairly, you don't need a miracle to prove the math works. You just need to look at the math.
But looking at the math is the one thing they cannot afford to do.
The demand for a miracle is a designed impossibility. Demanding a supernatural event as a precondition for accepting totally rational, observable evidence of their society's failure is how they maintain control.
So it's not about skepticism at all.
Not at all. The Malad don't actually want proof. They want to maintain the appearance of intellectual rigor. You know, oh, we are very rigorous, we require extraordinary, irrefutable cosmic evidence, while endlessly evading the actual data that is sitting right in front of them.
It is the universal strategy of vested interests facing inconvenient data. If you are listening to this, you have seen this playbook. Think about the tobacco industry in the mid-20th century.
Oh, perfect example.
The medical data showing harm was right there, completely rational, observable, and peer-reviewed. But the vested interests funded think tanks to say, well, we need absolute proof. We need an impossible standard of 100% indisputable causality in every single case before we can possibly change our highly profitable business model.
Yep. Or the fossil fuel industry delaying climate action.
Exactly. They demand a scientific miracle, a level of prophetic certainty to delay systemic reform.
The mechanism is identical. It was written thousands of years ago, and it operates the exact same way today. The miracle demand allows the mullah to neutralize the messenger, to look like the reasonable, skeptical ones in the room, without ever once having to engage with the actual critique of their exploitative architecture.
So if the elites are running this incredibly sophisticated evasion tactic to protect their wealth, what is the actual alternative? How do you bypass that smokescreen?
You have to attack the concept of ownership itself.
Which brings us to the story of the prophet Salih, the nation of Thamud, and one of the most famous and frankly misunderstood metaphors in the text, the she-camel of God, or Naqatullah.
Yeah.
Now, I will admit, reading this casually, it sounds like pure folklore. Why is a camel at the center of an economic revolution?
I know, if read literally, it is completely baffling. But if you read it through the lens of systems engineering and resource management, it is a profoundly elegant metaphor for the concept of the public commons.
Okay, lay that out.
So in the society of Thamud, which, remember, was fracturing under the weight of severe economic hoarding and water monopolies, Salih points to a she-camel, a mobile resource unit in an agrarian society, and declares it Naqatullah, the camel of God.
Why attach God to the camel, or to the land it grazes on, or the water it drinks? What does that actually achieve economically?
Attaching God to a resource in this linguistic framework removes human ownership from that resource. In a society where every single drop of water and blade of grass is privatized by the elites, if you say, this is Chaudhry's camel, or this is the CEO's water supply, someone owns the means of production.
Right.
They can dictate who lives and who dies based entirely on who can pay the toll. But if you declare a resource belongs to God, which sociologically means it belongs to the universal system, to the public collectively, it can no longer be privatized. It is removed from the market.
That is a massive paradigm shift. You're saying Naqatullah isn't a magical glowing camel. It represents the very concept of the public commons.
It represents resources that are absolutely essential for baseline human survival. Water, grazing land, the basic means of sustenance. By designating these as belonging to the universal system, the elites can no longer charge a toll for survival.
So it's about universal access.
Yes. The earth is God's earth, meaning it is for all people equally, not just the mullah. It is a complete dismantling of absolute private property rights over essential survival resources.
It is a blueprint for an egalitarian economic model. It guarantees a floor of survival for every human being. But of course, the elites don't just sit back, stroke their chins, and say, wow, great point, Salih. That is a much more equitable system. We will release our monopolies immediately.
Far from it. When the public commons is established, how do the elites react? The text notes exactly what they do. They hamstring and kill the camel.
They violently destroy the public commons.
They don't just reject the idea intellectually. They deploy violence to destroy the egalitarian economic model, because they cannot survive as an elite class without their unfair advantage.
Right, because if the people don't need them.
Exactly. The mere existence of a free, publicly accessible resource is an existential threat to a system built entirely on artificial scarcity. If the peasants can get water for free from the public commons, they won't work themselves to death in the zamandar's fields.
So the elites destroy the public utility to force everyone back into reliance on their private monopolies.
Yes, which triggers the final, terrifying phase of this civilizational cycle, the law of requital, or Mukafat-e-Amal, and the architecture of collapse.
Okay, let's get into this. The elites have successfully killed the feedback loop, they've violently destroyed the public commons, and they've doubled down on their exploitation. What happens next? The text uses the phrase, "Vakapuma alathab," the punishment sees them.
And here we must reiterate, this is not arbitrary divine intervention. This is not an angry deity throwing a temper tantrum from the sky.
Right.
This is Mukafat-e-Amal, the inescapable law of requital. It is the principle of cause and effect, the laws of thermodynamics apply to human sociology.
Like physics, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. You push a system too far, it snaps back.
The punishment is highly specific to the failure mode of that exact society. A society that builds its infrastructure on the violent suppression of its working class is building a high-pressure boiler with no release valve.
That's a great visual.
Eventually, the pressure exceeds the tensile strength of the metal, and the boiler explodes. The explosion isn't a punishment from the laws of thermodynamics. It is the natural, inevitable result of ignoring the laws of thermodynamics. The architecture that refused correction simply accumulated the stress that eventually destroyed it.
The source material highlights another phrase here, fasuna mutasarafun, which translates to, how evil were the evildoers. But based on the framework we are building, evil here isn't a moral hand-wringing judgment, is it?
No, it is a cold, diagnostic verdict. In the Quranic register, evil means a structural flaw. It means designing and operating a system that produces outcomes fundamentally contrary to human flourishing. The nations that refused the feedback loop didn't just make a theological faux pas. They accumulated uncorrected system errors. They let the structural flaws compound until the architecture of their civilization literally sheared apart.
The imagery used in the text to describe this collapse is so visceral. It mentions the Damdama.
The flattening, The roller.
When the systemic collapse finally happens, the Damdama doesn't check your bank account or your political titles. It levels the high and the low equally. The elites who built their castles on exploitation, who thought their walled capital cities and their hoarded wealth would protect them from the misery they were creating outside, are flattened right alongside the system they exploited.
The collapse of the ecosystem consumes the parasites just as surely as it consumes the host.
And this raises a profound philosophical and, I guess, operational question. How do societies function when the elites completely deny this kind of long-term accountability? The text points out that these elites consistently mock the idea of future consequences.
Well, completely.
They live only for the immediate present, the dunya, hoarding wealth now, extracting maximum value in the current quarter, and completely ignoring the compounding systemic debt they are leaving for the future.
Right, because if you are a corrupt CEO or a tyrant, and you know you can bribe the human-made legal systems, you don't care about the long-term damage. Human courts are deeply flawed.
Judges can be bought.
Exactly. Crimes can be hidden in offshore accounts or buried in shell companies. If you escape the societal court, you feel like you've won the game.
And this is where the text introduces the sociological necessity of Akhirah, the concept of the afterlife or the ultimate future consequence. Now, again, we have to put aside the Renaissance paintings of harps and clouds.
Please do.
Look at it as the ultimate, inescapable objective record. The source notes make a brilliant, highly analytical comparison between animal and human consciousness here to explain why this is necessary.
Right, the analogy of the ox eating the crop. Let's walk through that.
Okay, let's do it.
Animals live entirely in the physical, immediate present. If an ox wanders into a neighbor's field and eats their crop, the ox isn't committing a crime. It has no malice. It has no intent. It is just biological machinery responding to hunger.
Sure.
But humans possess intent. We have conscious choice, foresight, and the terrifying ability to engineer complex systems of exploitation. Therefore, human actions leave a permanent imprint on something deeper than just the physical world.
They leave an imprint on the self, what the text calls the Nafs.
The concept of Akhirah operates as a permanent data log of human intent. It is an immutable ledger. Every choice to exploit, every act of hoarding, every time you knowingly intercept the water from the thirsty field, it writes a line of corrupted code into your own nafs.
Wow.
The source notes reference the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche's concept here. Nietzsche argued that the criminal is ultimately destroyed from the inside by their own crime. The act of violating the social contract creates a cognitive and spiritual dissonance that degrades the criminal's own psyche.
It's fascinating you bring that up because the notes also reference the poet and philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who wrote extensively about this idea of the ego or the nafs. Iqbal's framing is that your actions either integrate and strengthen your ego or they disintegrate and dissolve it.
Yes, Iqbal argued that the nafs is not a static soul you are just born with. It is something you actively construct through your choices. If your choices are built on Fasad, on creating imbalance and exploiting others, you are building your nafs out of rotting materials.
So the ultimate punishment isn't external. It's not a warden locking you in a cell with fire. It is the natural, cumulative result of your own systemic corruption catching up to you.
That's the essence of it.
Even if you evade the earthly courts, your own internal ledger, your data log will be read out loudly by the universe. The system balances its books eventually, whether it manifests macroscopically in the Damdama collapse of the civilization or microscopically in the ultimate reckoning of the self. You cannot cheat the fundamental laws of reality, no matter how clever your intellect is.
The universe, in this framework, is a closed system of cause and effect. Justice isn't a moral suggestion. It is a structural requirement for continuity.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. We started with a mission to read Surah Al-Mu'minun, verses 34 to 43, not as a story of angry gods, but as a masterclass in civilizational systems engineering.
We did.
And looking at it from Noah all the way down through the sequence of nations, the law of requital operates with terrifying mathematical consistency.
The permanence of the pattern is what elevates it from a collection of historical anecdotes to a fundamental sociological law. The text isolates 4 unchanging variables of civilizational collapse.
Okay, walk me through the 4.
Variable 1, an elite class whose privilege and power depend entirely on an exploitative socioeconomic architecture.
Variable 2, a messenger functioning as a systemic feedback loop who accurately and objectively diagnoses the contradictions and fatal flaws in that architecture.
Variable 3, a PR label calling the messenger crazy, fake, or just a human, applied aggressively by the elites to neutralize the feedback without ever having to address the actual data.
And variable 4. The massive compounding accumulation of uncorrected system errors until the entire architecture suffers a total catastrophic collapse at Damdama.
Those 4 variables are completely static. The text demonstrates that they do not change from nation to nation or from era to era. The mechanism of failure is universal.
So if the mechanism is universal, the only variable that actually changes from one civilization to the next is the timing of the collapse.
Just a question of how long the boiler can handle the pressure before the metal shears.
Which brings us to the present day. We look around at our own global supply chains, our own political stratifications, our own massive wealth inequalities.
Which leaves us with a fascinating and perhaps slightly terrifying new thought to consider. If the architects of our modern socioeconomic reality are increasingly not even human, if we are handing the administration of resources, the algorithmic trading, and the social feeds over to artificial intelligence, how does this cycle apply?
That is a wild thought. If AI and algorithms become the new infallible architects of our systems, optimizing purely for engagement or profit without a moral baseline, who or what serves as the messenger?
Exactly.
How do you deliver a diagnostic feedback loop to a black box algorithm before the digital Damdama hits?
It suggests the battle of wits is about to move to a completely new frontier, one where the uncorrected system errors happen at the speed of light.
If you are listening to this, I hope you look at the systems you participate in every day with a slightly sharper eye. Keep questioning the architecture around you. Keep looking for the diagnostic feedback, and maybe we can fix the engine before it catches fire. That's our deep dive for today. Keep digging, and we will see you next time.